Alright guys, so we're going to keep rolling with chapter 37 in period 8. We're going to be talking today about pretty much just the civil rights movement. So I'm going to be getting into two new phases of the movement now that segregation has officially ended in the United States thanks to the Civil Rights Act. The next step of the civil rights movement and their goal is going to be voting, and then I'll get into the younger generation of activists and the Black Power movement and how all of that evolved. So if you've taken civil liberties, hopefully almost all of this is going to sound familiar. So, like I said, after segregation was officially ended, the next step and the next goal of the civil rights movement and its activists is going to be to get actually equal voting access. We know that there's a big ripple effect when it comes to not being able to vote. And we know that there were a lot of barriers in place against African Americans actually being able to vote in the South, in most southern states. If you remember, the 15th Amendment actually gave all African American men the right to vote, and then the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote. So in theory, everyone can vote. It's just the registration process and all of the barriers that the South has been putting in place since Reconstruction ended, since the Jim Crow period. All of those are still in place. Not necessarily grandfather clauses, but literacy tests, poll taxes, and the South had also developed a million other tools to use to their advantage to keep Black people from voting still. And like I said, there are ripple effects. If you vote, or if you're registered to vote, that's also the only way that you can be chosen for jury duty. So if there are no Black people registered to vote, then there's a zero possibility of a Black juror. So we know that every jury is going to be an all-white jury. That's not good for any person of color who's being accused of a crime, and it's also not good of any person of color who's the victim of a crime where the perpetrator is white. The Emmett Till case is a perfect example. On top of the jury aspect of things, there's so much more aside from that. When you don't have any person of color who's voting, then you owe those voters nothing. Most politicians are going to cater to their constituents, and their constituents are their voters, not necessarily the people that they represent. So, for example, you are going to have every elected politician does not need to seek the vote of a Black person in the South, so they don't need to seek the approval of a Black person in the South. The group whose approval and vote they need to be seeking is white Americans in the South. So that's just going to continue, and they're going to be continuing to support racist legislation and continue to take racist action or ignore racist action. On top of that, you can't run for an elected office unless you are actually registered. So what that guarantees is that every single governor, mayor, sheriff, school board member, county commissioner, anything of that nature is all going to be white people. And they're going to institute a power structure in which Black people in that community are completely non-existent in terms of how the government of that area sees them, which is how we saw so many situations like the Emmett Till case happen. He had a DA that was white who was elected by white by white voters, who was only held accountable to white voters. We had an all-white, all-male jury, an all-white, all-male police force and police commissioner. It snowballs, and that's how we see things like that happen. So getting African Americans registered to vote is a huge goal now of the movement, because it could bring a lot of positivity. So SNCC is going to be one of the first groups to go in and start on this from the beginning. And they decided to specifically target the state of Mississippi. Mississippi has a very high African American population. They had 5 counties in Mississippi where there were more African Americans than there were white Americans. And all 5 of those counties, not one of those African Americans was actually registered to vote. So we see those barriers that the Jim Crow era has put in place are working. Like I said, it's not just literacy tests and poll taxes. It's some places, if you registered to vote, they would put your name in the paper. They would put your name and your address in the paper as a congratulations on exercising your civic duty. But if you are a Black person living in Money, Mississippi, if you register to vote, they publish your name and your address in the paper, that could bring racial terrorism to your front door. You know, you're potentially now a target for violence. That's not something people wanted. On top of that, some counties instituted a policy of a voucher system where if you were going to register to vote, you had to have someone who was already registered to vote to vouch for you. The only people registered to vote were white people. What white person is going to be your voucher and vouch for you to get your voter registration? Not a lot of them, especially in the South. So this was just, like I said, one thing after another that had been working. So they focused on Mississippi first, SNCC did, in the summer of 1964. And they called it the Freedom Summer Project. And they invited, you know, people all over the country, to white people, black people, whatever, come to the Mississippi and help SNCC register these people to vote and get around these voter registration, you know, barriers and actually start to exercise some democracy here. So people came in droves, white people, black people from all over the country, from the North, from the West, from the Midwest, everywhere. And they were able to start to get some people registered to vote, but it also erupted in a lot of violence. There were, you know, riots in some of these cities as more people began to come in, because of course there's going to be a huge backlash from the Southern community in those areas, from the white Southern community. You know, like, not only are you coming here, not only do they see SNCC coming there and like stirring up trouble and trying to get people registered to vote, but they're also bringing Yankees, you know, they're bringing Northerners, white and black, to come tell you how to run your town and get people registered to vote. Not good. Definitely the most famous instance of violence during that Freedom Summer is known as the Mississippi burning murders. You can see on the slide the missing poster for those three men right there. They were all from the North and had come to the South to help in the Freedom Summer Project and get people registered to vote. But unfortunately, you know, all three of them went missing one day, and SNCC knew, you know, it was the Klan, and they knew that they had probably been killed. And so they were like, you know, we need to find them. But the state of Mississippi, of course, you know, state government and the police force was like, well, you know, they could have gone anywhere. They're not from here. They're not local boys. We don't know anything about them. Like, we're not going to waste police time on looking for these guys. So they actually had to pressure President Johnson to send in federal investigators, and they did find the three of them had been shot, executed at point blank range, buried in a very shallow ditch. No, a dam, actually. They had been buried in a dam. Obviously not a concrete one, but and you know, surprise, it was the Klan. They did arrest a few guys for this situation, not the state of Mississippi, because who are they going to arrest? No one. It probably, you know, basically was the state of Mississippi that committed these murders. But the federal government does arrest, you know, maybe 8 people and charge them with conspiracy because they saw this as a violation of you know, your civil liberties in terms of voter registration. And of those 8 that they arrested, only a few were found guilty, and they all served minor sentences. So no one was actually, you know, found guilty of murder for the murder of these 3 guys. And that there are just one circumstance. Like, there were dozens of things that happened like this all over the state of Mississippi. And, you know, Mississippi and their Freedom Summer Project, that was just one area. Now, one thing that did come out of the Freedom Summer Project was actually a new political party, a small third party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. When you register to vote, you get to register for a party if you want, Republican, Democrat, Independent, third party, whatever. And there were plenty of people who wanted to register as Democrat because they believed in a lot of the things of the Democratic Party. But Southern Democrats were very against, you know, integration or any other, like, civil rights type of agenda. So they don't want to join the racist Democratic Party, but they believe in all these other things that the Democratic Party supports. So instead of, they basically said, you know, we're going to form our own Democratic Party for the state of Mississippi, one that doesn't include this racist white power structure. They wanted to be recognized as the official Democratic Party of Mississippi, but obviously the Democratic Party didn't agree to that. So they didn't get any real power. But it was, you know, an opportunity to see black people in not just the South, but in Mississippi, a very, you know, very strictly segregated area where there was a lot of oppression among the entire black community. It was impressive to see these people, like, actually exercising their rights, which is very cool. So aside from that, what is the SCLC doing? That next spring, they decided to launch their next campaign to focus on voter registration in the town of Selma, which is in Alabama. So what they wanted to do is to get into Selma, begin protesting. Dr. King was going to go. They were going to protest in front of City Hall, try to get some people registered to vote, start to stir up a little trouble, attract media attention, and then, put pressure on the federal government to enforce, which was basically their, recipe for success in other places that they had been, like in Birmingham when they were finally successful in the Birmingham campaign. So they went in the spring, like I said, and began protesting. The public safety officer, or the head of the Alabama state troopers that they were having to go against, was a guy named Jim Clark, who was kind of like Bull Connor, pretty aggressive, hardcore segregationist. In Alabama, the governor of Alabama was a man named George Wallace, who is known for his very famous inaugural address when he was sworn into office as the governor of Alabama. He invoked a lot of, Confederate history and talked about the flag and the people of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, all of these other like Confederate soldiers and stuff. Not necessarily that any of them were from Alabama, but he was very much trying to draw on that like Southern heritage type of vibes. And in the speech, he gave a very famous quote where he said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And the white people of Alabama loved it. They ate it up. They kept electing George Wallace. They loved him. Eventually, he ran for president. Eventually, he got shot and paralyzed. But nevertheless, when George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, of course he's not gonna support any of this. He's gonna be mostly on Jim Clark's side. So they started doing protests in Selma. It wasn't just the SCLC. SNCC had already been in Selma for quite some time, so they joined in as well. And they planned to launch or organize a march from Selma to Montgomery. Montgomery being the capital of Alabama. They were going to march from Selma to Montgomery, which is very far. It was going to take, a couple of days. They would have to camp out and stuff. And once they got to Montgomery, Dr. King would give this whole speech for voting rights. So on the day that they launched the speech, they not the day they launched the speech. The day they launched the march was a Sunday. They got to the edge of this bridge that leads out of Selma called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You can look up pictures online, and you've probably seen them before, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've seen the movie Selma, and you'll see some of this in the documentary that you're going to watch, Eyes on the Prize. But they got to the edge of the bridge, and they were met with a line of Alabama state troopers, some on foot, some on horseback, some in cars. Jim Clark gets on the megaphone, and he says, "Turn around and go back." They say, "We have every right to be here. They're not in the road. They're on the sidewalk. We just want to pass through." And at that point, Jim Clark basically authorizes like a charge of the state troopers. And with K-9 units, horses, tear gas, clubs, they began attacking these protesters, these marchers. I mean, it was men, women, children, the elderly, everyone. So this day becomes known as Bloody Sunday. Today, Congressman John Lewis, he was there and marched that day. He got a fractured skull. They had to turn their the church that they had been using as their headquarters into a hospital to like treat the wounded. It was extremely difficult, and you will see some of that footage in the documentary piece that you're going to watch. It's very violent, and you'll see there's video of it. It made it on the news that night, and so of course there's going to be a lot of pressure on Lyndon Johnson. Like, what are you going to do, man? Kind of like how when those pictures came out of the dogs and the fire hoses in Birmingham, this is a similar situation. But Johnson isn't Kennedy. Is he going to support the protesters? Remember that George Wallace is also a Democrat. Is he going to toe the party line? Is he going to try not to make waves with Southern Democrats? Is he going to try to carry those voters? Nobody really knew what he was going to do. Now, Dr. King wasn't at the first march on Bloody Sunday because he was home. He was planning on meeting them out later with, once they were camping, and he would finish the march with him. Why was he home? dealing with some personal marital issues with his wife. But nevertheless, he was planning on meeting them. Once this whole thing happened and it was obviously on TV, he went back to Selma, and they began planning a new march that they were going to do on Tuesday. Tuesday comes. Johnson has been begging Dr. King on the phone, like, don't march yet. I can't guarantee your safety. Like, George Wallace isn't backing down. Jim Clark isn't backing down. Like, don't march. You don't have the authority to march. Like, if you march, they can arrest you because you don't have a permit. They march. They get to the edge of the bridge. The same line of state troopers is standing there. And instead of marching forward and risking, another violent attack, they turn around. So that day becomes known as Turnaround Tuesday. So sort of a failed attempt. Finally, after a lot of negotiation between Dr. King and Lyndon Johnson, and after the assassination of Malcolm X, who I'll get to in a minute, Johnson finally was able to convince George Wallace to call down Jim Clark and to make sure he protected the marchers and didn't attack them. So they finally had their march, and they made it all the way to Montgomery, where Dr. King gave his big speech in support of voting rights. So after the march from Selma to Montgomery, there were 2 new pieces of legislation passed to support voting change across the country. The first was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests, and the next is going to be the 24th Amendment, which is going to end poll taxes across the country, which is positive. Now, here are some pictures from Bloody Sunday. You can see here, those are state troopers wearing their tear gas masks, gassing and attacking protesters. And this is people, carrying this woman who's been attacked back to the hospital, which was, hospital, basically, their church. So, while we're seeing this, part of the civil rights movement, the SCLC and SNCC, these nonviolent groups continuing to work for change, those groups have now existed for SNCC has at this point been around for a little more than 5 years. They were founded in 1960. The SCLC was founded in, closer to 1957, 1955. So some of these groups have been around for a decade. And when you're looking at, the NAACP and CORE, they've been around even longer. And we're starting to see a generation that has been brought up experiencing all this. A lot of older activists, people like Dr. King, he's in his 40s. This isn't something he's seen this his whole life, and he's seen, the era before the movement in which the Jim Crow laws and everything were in place, and he saw the, I guess you would say, almost the peaceful side of the oppression, and then this wave of movement that sparked violence. But we're also seeing this generation starting to grow up, this younger side, who was born during World War II or even right before, who's only seen violence, right? They saw the violence of World War II, and now they're seeing the violence of these social movements. The civil rights movement is just one. We've seen Korea. We're about to be getting into Vietnam, and the civil rights movement is just one area of social change where we saw people working. We're going to see the women's liberation movement, and the gay liberation movement, the student movement. And so it's just this constant period of social change. And so they're coming from a very different perspective. In addition to that, the Southern civil rights movement is going to be very different from the rest of the country. There were areas of the North or the West or the Midwest that were seeing, voter discrimination or perhaps, segregation of some kind. But overall, the main type of racism and oppression that those people were experiencing was not one that one law could change overnight. It was economic oppression, and that's a lot more difficult to overcome. That's generational. They can't just pass a law and say, we've ended economic oppression. That's not how that works. Even if they cut everyone a check, that wouldn't do anything, honestly. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of, differences in strategies, what is the right move. Now that voting has been solved and we're going to see a voter registration increase, what's the next move? Now, every aspect of the movement, SCLC, all these different groups, they all agreed economic oppression needed to be the next strategy, or needed to be the next goal, but strategy is where they didn't agree. And that's when we'll start to see things start to fracture. And now we're going to see two sides of the movement. We're going to see the nonviolent side, which was definitely like the Christian side, the conservative side of people like Dr. King and similar activists. And then we're going to see the emergence of this new, more militant and younger side. Without a doubt, the face of that side of the movement is going to be Malcolm X, who you see here on the slide on the top right. He was from Nebraska. He didn't always grow up in Nebraska, eventually moved to New York, where he spent most of his time, grew up really poor, pretty much orphaned early. He ended up going to jail, got involved with crime and stuff, because he was living in a high poverty area. When he was in prison, he converted to Islam, and he joined a group called the Nation of Islam, which is not like Sunni or Shiite Islam. It's a different category. It's sort of like its own denomination of Islam. And the best way I can put it is it's sort of like black nationalists and the Islamic religion combined. And if you don't remember what black nationalism is, that's something Marcus Garvey had, right, which was kind of like choosing to separate themselves from white Americans. So the Nation is still around today. It is still a group today. They do not believe that, they basically don't believe in equality. They do support segregation, and it's really because they don't want to be around white people. White people are not allowed to join the Nation of Islam. White people are not allowed to set foot on church property for the nation. You cannot enter a mosque or anything at all that's owned or operated by the nation if you're white. And that was true then, it's true now. And so he got really involved with them, became one of their most outspoken and well-known members. He went on speaking tours all over the country when he got out of prison, and really became the voice of this new side of the movement. And his tagline became something called "By any means necessary." We need to get equality by any means necessary. His most famous speech was called "The Ballot or the Bullet," where he was talking about voting rights and voter registration. The ballot being the voting ballot, or the bullet meaning the gun. So he wasn't necessarily trying to advocate for violence. He wasn't saying like, let's start a riot right now, like we're going to kill people. But he was saying, like if your rights aren't being respected, if violence is how you're going to get it back, do it. By any means necessary, right? Do whatever you have to do. And he was very critical of Dr. King. They did not really get along. They weren't pals. They both criticized each other in the press. Malcolm X said things, like all he does is sing songs, criticizing like the Christian side of the movement. When they used children in the Birmingham campaign, he said, very famously said, "I don't need children to fight my battles," things like that. And Dr. King accused him of alienating moderates and refusing to work with politicians, and anyone who is white at all makes it a lot more difficult to get any actual change done. So Dr. King was just as critical of him. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, actually, by the Nation of Islam. Before that, he had taken his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he had met other Muslims and other people, some of which were white Muslims. And he started to realize like maybe he had reached as far as he could go in his own spiritual evolution as a member of the nation, and he decided to convert to Sunni Islam and leave the nation behind. But the nation saw that as treason. And so the leader of the nation, Elijah Muhammad, and the future leader of the nation, Louis Farrakhan, who is still the leader of the nation to this day, put out a hit on him. And Malcolm X founded his own organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And then one day while he was giving a speech to that organization, 3 members of the nation came out and shot him with machine guns, like a bunch of times. If you've seen the movie with Denzel, where he plays Malcolm X, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But when Malcolm X was killed in such a violent way, it sort of proved everything that he had been saying. And it gives more fuel to this new, younger, more militant side. And that's when we'll start to see the Black Power movement really emerge. Malcolm X didn't ever used the phrase, really, Black Power. That wasn't a phrase he came up with. It was actually coined by a member of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael. He had been the president of SNCC for a while. That's him there on the slide beside Malcolm X. But Stokely Carmichael, when he said Black Power, what he meant was, he wasn't saying, Black Power like white power. When you hear white power, that means white supremacy. Black Power here means basically when you say we want equality, that implies that Black people are here and white people are here. And when you want equality, that means you want to lift Black people up to meet white people, and that they need to make themselves equal. He's saying that's not reality. Black people and white people are equal. The power structures in place, though, just don't treat them that way. So what we need to do is empower Black people to, demand equal treatment. So it's kind of like just a change in vocabulary. And it really focused on ethnic pride and, investing in the Black community, whether that meant businesses, education, whatever. And there were a lot of groups that got involved with this. There was, Black people who supported Black Power in the NAACP, in SNCC, in CORE, in all of these groups. But probably the most famous group to put these Black Power beliefs into action is going to be the Black Panther Party, who you see also there on the slide. So the Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland by two guys, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, Oakland being a suburb of San Francisco, and it was designed to basically be like a protection or police force for the Black community in Oakland, which was very low income, a very low income community, and they had been having lots of problems with police brutality, and so they started by doing this thing called Cop Watch, where they would literally, if you were getting arrested or questioned by the police, the Black Panthers would watch the entire thing take place, almost like a chaperone of police officers to make sure that nothing bad was happening. And then their program morphed, and at their peak they had tens of thousands of members all over the country. They had chapters in every state. There was a fairly big chapter of the Black Panthers in Charlotte. They did a lot of, community outreach. They served breakfast, hot breakfast to students who were from low-income neighborhoods who didn't have food, especially in the summer when schools were closed. They did clothing drives. They did medical treatment in hospitals. Even medical treatment for HIV and AIDS, which disproportionately, once that's recognized as an actual illness, once we get to the 1980s, and other diseases that, disproportionately affect African Americans, like sickle cell and things like that. They, like I said, did clothing drives. If you were looking for a job and you had a job interview, but you didn't have a suit to wear, you could get one from the Black Panthers for free. So like I said, they did a lot of community outreach, but they were a militant organization. They practiced the Second Amendment, supported it. They open carried. That's really how they gained so much notoriety in the beginning, was an open carried gun demonstration in Sacramento in California, where they showed up in their black berets and black leather jackets, all carrying, massive rifles across their chests and, those like ammo belt sash things. And that image of, a bunch of young, strong Black men in basically what looks like a uniform, they look like an army. And that freaked people out. That really freaked white people out. And that freaked out the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was already tapping the phone of Malcolm X, or who had died at that point, but was already tapping the phone of Martin Luther King Jr. and members, and Angela Davis, and members of the Women's Liberation Movement, members of the Students of Democratic Society. He was, very much trying to crack down on these social change groups. He said that they were the biggest threat to American democracy in the, domestically, period. That all these groups were our biggest, scare and needed to be our top priority. So the federal government put a lot of effort into silencing the Black Panthers. And as violence between law enforcement and them increased, and as they gained momentum and notoriety, they began to gain members. And when you grow in membership, you're bound to get some crazies in there. So there were some members of the Black Panthers who had gang affiliation. And of course, the media loved to, harp on that and blow that up. And then eventually that became their whole reputation, that it was, like a gang who fought with police, and slowly but surely the Black Panthers fizzled out, and they're not technically a party today, although they do have a few areas where members operate and still do some of those, programs like how they were doing back in the 1970s. But for the most part, they don't necessarily operate anymore. One thing that we're going to see coming out of the 1960s and getting into the 1970s here, and one of the reasons why the Black Power movement became so popular, was race riots and the increase of race riots. And this really starts in like 1967, 1968. 1968 was a rough year. 1968 was the year that Vietnam will take a turn for the worse, and it's also the year that Dr. King will be assassinated. He was taking part in a protest to support black sanitation workers in Memphis when he was shot by a man named James Earl Ray outside of his hotel room. And when he was shot and killed, race riots erupted immediately all over the country, every major city. And that was just, one time. Like, there are going to be dozens of race riots. We're going to see huge riots in Watts, which is in Los Angeles. We're going to see a big riot in Detroit. So President Johnson put together this special group called the Kerner Commission to investigate all these race riots. What's the cause? Why are all these, it was technically, I think, called the Committee on, like, Civil Disturbance or something like that. Why are all of these race riots taking place? So they do this whole investigation, and they publish this massive report, which basically said, why are all of these race riots taking place? Well, they're happening because of long-term racial oppression in these communities. Not rocket scientists, I'm sure, or rocket science. I'm sure they could have just asked someone before they wasted taxpayer money on a special commission to investigate all of this. And in the report, they recommended a whole lot of, city renewal projects and investments. You got to provide more funding to schools. You got to do jobs programs. Here's the way to end that oppression, and you'll end the race riots. And Johnson and the rest of the presidential administration and Congress basically said, cool, that's awesome, and then ignored it, didn't do anything, because now their focus is turned to Vietnam. So as this tension increases and violence and stuff is going to continue to get out of control, at the same time, Vietnam is becoming more and more and more of an issue in terms of politics and economics and culturally. We're drafting at this point. It was on more people's minds. So Johnson basically adopted the idea of, like, I can't worry about special interests. Meaning, I can't worry about issues that only affect black people, because Vietnam affects everyone. The war affects all of America. That needs to be my focus. And so we'll start to see towards the end of his presidency, he becomes less and less supportive of civil rights. He thinks, like, whatever, we ended segregation, we signed the Voting Act. Like, what else do you want from me? Isn't that enough? Now Vietnam needs to be my focus. So we'll start to see the movement pretty much fizzle out once we get to the 1970s. There will be some moments of progress here and there, but for the most part, we're not going to see another big wave of social change like this for African Americans for quite some time.